Hi, you're listening to Spare Notes, and I'm Jonah. I'm your host. In this interview, I talk to my friend and author Eleanor Henderson. Though not every author I bring on will have a strong tie to music, I thought it'd be fun to talk about her first novel, 10,000 Saints. The book came out in 2011. However, it was also turned into a movie with a bunch of movie stars 4 years later in 2015, which makes this year the 10-year anniversary of the movie. The book incorporates a lot of the straight edge hardcore music scene of the 1980s in New York City, which her husband was heavily involved in, and in Vermont as well. We got into some ideas about movies as adaptations, responsibility of writing, letting go of control in business or in personal life, and what it's like to get your novel turned into a movie starring your high school crush. Hello, Eleanor. How are you doing?
Hi, it's great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too. First of all, congratulations on the 10-year anniversary of your book, 10,000 Saints, becoming a movie.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. How are you? How have you been? What have you been doing today?
Today has been a pretty relaxing summer day. Did some working out, did my HIIT class.
What's a
I
hit class?
well, it's high intensity interval training, Jonah,
Oh,
and
okay.
self-designed today. I've got my faculty gym access for the summer. So it's been a pretty relaxing day, just hanging out with my boys and doing some errands. Yeah. How about you?
Well, I've been in some meetings, band stuff, and I've sent some emails, filled out some Google Sheets, and yeah, it's been pretty solid. It's weird having a million different things to do, and I've been trying to just build structure around my life with all these different things.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really busy. So I'm extra grateful that you took the time to read my book and watch the movie.
Yeah, I mean, this what I want to do is, be busy with literature and music pretty much. So that's what I want to do.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. Um, so before we get into 10,000 Saints, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. One is I wanted to know a little bit more about where you grew up. What was that place like? Did you move around a lot?
A fair amount. I was born in Greece, lived there for a year, and then after a short time in Georgia, settled in Gainesville, Florida when I was about a year and a half. And lived there in two different houses on the same street until I was about eight, so 1987.
Hmm.
And that was a great place to grow up. Tons of kids on my dirt road and, lots of 1980s mischief, riding our bikes all around the neighborhood and, getting to hang out at each other's houses while our parents smoked cigarettes in their lawn chairs. And it was a great childhood. And then when I was eight, I moved to West Palm Beach, Florida, really North Palm Beach, Florida, about 4 hours south. And that was really a different Florida, really removed from some of the authenticity that I really experienced in Gainesville, in the sense that the South Florida that a lot of us see in the media was true for me, and that, we had access to a big, beautiful shopping mall with, beautiful designer clothes, but everything was very manicured, very air conditioned, and very, packaged. So I was really eager to get out of Florida. One of the things that was a kind of lifeline to me was bands that would come into town. So we would back then look at the back page of the TGIF magazine, which was part of the Palm Beach Post, to find out what bands were going to be coming through in the next few months. And so I would eagerly read that, as a teenager, turn to the back page and find out what shows were coming through and get really excited and save all my babysitting money for those events. And yeah, so and went to a lot of grunge and alternative shows that came through, and I didn't really have a huge scene with the kids that I grew up with, but like had enough friends who enjoyed going to shows. There were definitely at least one concert that like my dad took me to. I think Soul Asylum in 1985. I got my 70-year-old dad to drive me to. So I was really eager for those kinds of experiences, to be around live music, but at the same time felt a little bit alone in it.
You
So
were,
yeah,
what age did you start going to those shows?
14, I'd say. Yeah, 14. We'd often have to go down to Fort Lauderdale or Miami. And those were, huge concert venues. So
Hmm.
it was common to see somebody very far away on the stage, which was very exciting to me. But when I met my husband and learned about the kind of music scene that he had come from, he also spent part of his childhood in South Florida, but had come from New York City. And so he, came of age in the clubs that my characters in 10,000 Saints do. It was a
Mm.
very, very different kind of musical experience. And so, I think I brought with me the kind of stadium experience and really had a appetite for more intimate musical encounters.
Yeah. Do you think that also influenced you, like being in South Florida, South Beach, Florida area? Did that influence you, like leaving to for undergrad, like going kind of far away?
Absolutely. I was operating under the myth that, the further south you got, the sort of more removed from culture you were. Like that is not true, but this was very much something that I held to be true as a teenager. And so I wanted to get
Mhm.
as far north as I could. And so I ended up going to college in Vermont, have some family roots in Vermont. So ended up there, and there's a bit of a, a strong music scene there too, I'd say, small but mighty, and have kind of lived up and down the East Coast, lived in Virginia and New York City, and now I'm in upstate New York in Ithaca.
How and when did you get into writing?
I've always written, so from the time I was a kid in Florida, I really wanted to be a writer and was writing stories. I had the sense that Florida was not a place where people were writers, which again is false myth. But I wanted to pursue writing in college. So when I got to college and discovered what a writing workshop was my freshman year, I thought, oh, I don't ever want to leave this place. And so figured out a way to keep studying writing and then teaching writing. So as you know, I now teach at Ithaca
Hmm.
College.
What was that feeling when you were before you experienced a writing workshop like? What was that relationship with your writing? It was like, oh, I feel like, writing a little story today, or writing about an experience I had. Like, what was that?
Yeah.
Like, what was that relationship? Because it had to change when you experienced a workshop, I'm guessing, like in a way.
Yeah, I guess it was a little bit lonely, but it was sort of fun. I didn't know what I was doing. I was a big reader as a kid. And, we didn't have a really lively literary scene where I grew up in suburban Florida, but we did have a Barnes and Noble. And so I would go to the Barnes and Noble as much as I could and discovered on the bottom shelf of the literary magazine section this amazing menu of literary magazines. And I discovered Story magazine. I'm going to get one off of my shelf
Oh,
behind
sure.
me. Story magazine. This is summer 1995 issue. This is great classic illustrations. And I just started reading stories. And so I learned what a short story was. I also was pulling books off of my parents' shelves and
Oh,
had
sweet.
a sense of, what literature was. But stories and story magazines, I still remember some of these stories, introduced me to that genre. And so I thought I could write a story. And so I started writing stories on my own that weren't very good, that were really immature, but I was sort of learning the vocabulary of them and not really sharing them with people, maybe one or two friends. And I had a great high school English teacher
Ooh,
who also supported me in writing. So I was lucky in that I had a lot of writing and books around me, even if I didn't have a strong community of writers. And that was one of the things I was really seeking.
that's awesome. Um, let's talk about your first novel, 10,000 Saints. What spurned the idea of the book?
While I was living in New York City, I still have the notebook where I took my first notes on the book on the subway in 2001. So I moved to New York City after graduating from college. And it's 2001, just a couple of months before 9/11.
Mm,
And I started taking notes on the subway. I had to work three jobs, as many people do in New York. And so I just
mm,
spent a lot of time commuting and writing on the subway. And at the same time, I was kind of falling in love with this city that I felt very much an outsider in, but I had this connection through my husband, so then boyfriend. He grew up in and out of the city, and his mother had lived on St. Mark's Place for, at that point, more than 20 years. And so he had spent much of his adolescence on St. Mark's Place. And so we'd spent a
mm,
lot of time in that part of the city. It was kind of our destination. And he was really, rich with nostalgia at that point. This was early 2000s for the time, just 15 years prior when he had been
mhm.
skateboarding those streets as a kid. And at that point, the city had changed so much. And of course, it's changed even more since then.
Yeah.
And and I felt his love and some of the, very outrageous and wonderful stories that he told about that time. And at the same time, I was sort of thinking about the larger themes of the world of straight edge that he had belonged to as a kid and thinking about what rich material I found it to be. And at the same time, I was sort of had in my head this idea for a character who is adopted and doesn't really fit in with his adopted family and is having a really hard time as a teenager, sort of finding his way, as many teenagers do. So it was kind of a confluence of those things. And I kind of remember the moment, and this is often the way that the writing process works for me early on, where I have like two ideas. So I have this sort of this kid who is adopted, and my brother was adopted. And so adoption narratives have always been really interesting to me. And
Mhm.
then this idea for writing about straight edge in New York City in the 80s. And then when I kind of realized that they're the same story, then that friction started to happen, which was exciting.
How did you realize that they were the same story?
It takes me longer than I would like, but I think I just, my process early on is just taking pages and pages of notes, and so lots of what ifs. And I think I was just having a conversation with myself about these two parts of the story. Did they want to be the same? And I think I even wrote like, oh, in the margin somewhere, like, oh, this is Jude. This is the same person. Um,
Mm,
and I don't always, base characters off of people, but I was in some ways thinking about the story of the adopted family and Aaron's story in his childhood. And so there's a little bit of fusing of my brother's world and my boyfriend's world at that point. Um, I wish I could say that that was the last time I wrote a book about a male figure in my life. I'm trying to tell my own stories these days, but
wait, was your
I
brother adopted?
he was, yeah, my older brother. Yeah.
Okay, my mother was adopted, and then her siblings also.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Are
Yeah,
you also obsessed with adoption stories?
I'm not so, no, not so much. I know it affected my mother, but I'm interested.
Yeah, I think I'm just
There's
really interested in the different, configurations of family and sibling dynamics. And, the book is fiction, but I was young when I was writing this book and was definitely influenced by these sort of questions and silences and deeply interested in inheritance, both like, nature and nurture.
Hmm.
So yeah, those were just some of the things that I was thinking about as I started writing the book in the early 2000s. And then it took me about 10 years to figure the thing out. So it took a while.
10 years. I was going to ask how long it took. 10 years. That's a little while.
Yeah, 10 years from the time I started writing it in mid 2001 to 2011 when it came out.
How did you keep the faith?
I think I was really stubborn. I mean, a lot of people I know have one or two or three novels in a drawer, that were sort of their starter novels. And in a way, I think about this book as being all of those. It changed a lot as I was writing it. The main character, Jude, was sort of always at the heart of it, but there are a lot of things that changed. The point of view changed. The cast of characters changed. So I think I kept the faith by just reinventing it as I needed to and,
Mhm.
figured out how to write a better novel with each draft, I hope. But I really started over many times and lost faith a lot of times and,
Mm.
was going through a lot of life during that period of my 20s, getting married and having a baby and starting, teaching
Mhm.
career. So it was slow and it was definitely on ice for a long time. And even though I would put it in a drawer, I had faith that I would bring it back out. It was the thing I always wanted to be working on. And somebody just told me, I can't remember who this quote is attributed to, maybe Donald Barthelme, that a writer is a professional problem solver. And even though solving the problem of this book was really infuriating at times, I
Mhm.
think I also wanted to finish. I wanted to solve the puzzle that was the book. So stubbornness and a faith that this story was an interesting one, that the world that I was writing about was an interesting one.
What was the research like going into the book? I'm guessing some interpersonal uh, from people you know, but also people you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, research looked like a lot of different things. I had an Aaron, living with me, an assistant, a personal research assistant, whether he liked it or not. So a lot of the stuff about the straight edge bands, the book is about this fictional band in Vermont that includes a lot of teenage boys, and there are real bands in New York City and other places that were really popular at the time in the late 1980s. And so I knew of these bands in this world, but just really peripherally. And so, I would often knock on his office door and say, like, what band would have split a 7-inch with Gorilla Biscuits in the fall of 1987? And he could tell me. Um, and then he also was a great fact checker in that regard as well. So some of the research was that, just listening to the music, immersing myself in like all of the VHS tapes that he had taken at shows.
Oh,
So he was definitely like the first line of defense. But then, reading interviews and um, reached out at some points to some people in the scene when the book was closer to being done. And and that was the sort of the straight edge stuff, which definitely was the stuff that kind of gave me the greatest pause, the greatest anxiety, because I was, really not of that world. And it's a pretty
yeah.
insidery world, like it's an exclusive club, and having some lady come in years later to want to write about it, I understood that that would be a suspicious position. But then there was other research too about New York. And as I continued writing the book, I realized I was writing a book about New York at a particular time. And that was a different New York than the one I was writing from.
Were there like were there a certain amount of musicians you talked to, like 10, 20, 30, 40? Like, did you just talk to everyone you could?
No, it wasn't that many. Toward the end of the process, when I was like doing things like seeking permissions, we were like developing a book trailer, or then when the book was becoming a movie, or when reviews were coming out of the book. And certain things needed to happen. I needed to get permission, or I needed to ask to use a video. Um, though, maybe half a dozen people I spoke to, but mostly it was, and then when I was doing events, I reached out to like 242 Club in Burlington, for example, to do an event with
Mhm.
and it was a little bit odd. Like in a way, if I could advise my younger self, I would probably advise myself to be more open and to, do more of that kind of research early, but I felt pretty protective and pretty nervous about it until the book was almost done.
Didn't you say you talked to Ian Mackaye?
I did. I talked to Ian Mackaye after the book was complete. So um, I did send him a copy. So when you publish a novel, your publisher will give you an author questionnaire where you have to sort of list people who might be interested in the book, both for
Hmm.
blurbs, but also for press coverage and things like that. So he was on the list, and so we sent him a copy. And he kindly wrote to me, I believe, to say, I received the book. I'll try to read it without missing anything. I mean, like as you would expect from a punk legend. And
Uh-huh.
I think he sent me a picture at that point of my book on his stack of books that were on his typewriter. So like it was like under like 20 other books or something.
Oh,
So I was
wow.
like, okay, I'm not going to get my hopes up, but really nice of him to reach back out. And then he wrote to me not long after, I think a few weeks after, and said, "Oh, I read your book and I like it. I'm not going to blurb it, but I like it. Nice job."
Cool.
And that was really cool. I didn't expect him to like offer his endorsement. There seems like there's something kind of anti about doing something like that. But that was our first
Sure.
interaction. And then little did I know I would get this off of the wall. Here, maybe I can move you over. But this was on the cover of the New York Times. I'm just
Um,
pointing out the New York Times book review cover is a picture of him, of Ian Mackaye. And that picture was taken by his brother. And I didn't know this at the time, but the New York Times editors had reached out to Ian to ask him for permission to use the picture on the cover of the New York Times.
oh, wow.
So, and he said yes, which was really kind. So that kind of re-sparked our connection. And then I reached out to invite him to my reading at Politics and Prose in DC, and he came and we had a lovely chat. And that was one of the first few times that we have met. So it's been a lovely exchange every few years or so. But during the making of the movie, there was also occasion to talk to him and get his point of view, and including the fact that one of his songs is in the movie. So we had to get his permission for that.
Right. What was the convergence of ethnographic-esque studies and fiction writing for the book, and how did you see that functioning as a writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think as I, as a writer, maybe tend to veer too far into the like ethnographic study and feel that I need to research and investigate and uncover and understand as much as I
Hmm.
can about a world before I feel, sort of able to write about it. So
Hmm.
I maybe spent too much time doing that, even though I didn't do that many interviews with individuals in the scene. I was still doing research on my own. So I think, I had a lot of fun inventing this band called the Green Mountain Boys and thinking about who they were in Vermont. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know if this will answer your question exactly, but I think it might kind of get at some of the circular ways that I began to think about this band as like a fictional entity. So
Sure.
in early drafts of the book took place in Burlington. So the parts in Vermont that take place in that state were in Burlington, which is like a very specific city with a very specific history,
Uh-huh.
with, Bernie Sanders as mayor at that time and, Ben and Jerry's on
Sweet.
every corner. So, so I was really spent a lot of time trying to kind of capture Burlington. So the book takes place, the early part of the book takes place in Burlington, and then it goes to New York City and kind of weaves back and forth. And I felt that the book needed to be really true to that history. And so, weirdly enough, when I was at the University of Virginia getting my MFA and working on this book,
Uh-huh.
somebody in my very small workshop of like 8 students total happened to grow up in Burlington at the exact same time and was really deeply involved in the punk scene. So on the
Whoa.
one hand, it was like really cool to have this, person who could verify and fact check. But it was also sort of daunting because she would come to workshop and say things like, actually, they don't have school buses in Burlington, so Jude wouldn't have been on the school bus. Or she said one time, I actually lived with one of the bandmates from Screaming Broccoli, so they actually didn't live on that street. So it was really a wild moment where I had to sort of scratch my head and figure out like, okay, do I really want to spend my time figuring out like where did Screaming Broccoli live in
Yeah.
1988? Or do I just want to create a fictional universe? So I scrambled Burlington and turned it into Lintonburg. It's just a different version of that city. And
Uh-huh.
kind of freed me to really think about this band as being, a fictional creation in a fictional space that is a Burlington that's kind of analog for it. But what really mattered was that these were kids in an American town who, felt really distant from the kind of epicenter of musical culture, sort of like I did as a kid. And that this band could be itself and be unique and didn't have to necessarily be a representation of,
Yeah.
straight edge bands in 1988.
That's also just so wild how just switching the name of a city or town can like open up your writing, and I'm guessing it made you feel more, yeah, made you feel more comfortable and free to make other decisions from there.
It did, yeah. I think a name can be really powerful. So I probably spend too much time even on characters' names. But yeah, it was a small decision that opened up a lot for me.
And that I want to go back to this question I had written down, and that's just kind of a overview of your kind of identity as a writer and maybe as a person too. And it's like, and then we'll go into the movie.
Sure.
But like, what's your position as a person who wants to understand the people and the society around you, and how do you think that motivates your writing or existing in the world?
Wow, this is a really good question that I'm trying to think about how to answer. I do think
Yeah.
that that motivates me a lot in my
Mm.
writing. All of my books are really different, but when I try to sort of explain what connects them to me, it's that, sort of sociological perspective. I'm really interested in systems as well as individuals. So whether the
Hmm.
system is a family or sharecropping or the medical system, I'm really interested in figuring out the way that people kind of work within their limitations and the stories that they tell about um, themselves and each other. So yeah, I think that I'm often drawn to telling stories that are sort of secondhand, like sort of outside of my reach.
Hmm.
And that has been true in both my novels, which are historical in some way. I think that the process of doing so has, over the years, I've become more aware of my own positionality and
Hmm.
less inclined to sort of enter spaces that are not my own. So this is not to say that I don't and won't do that at all, but it's definitely a bridge that I've tried to cross, and it's difficult to do, and it's not
Hmm.
always advisable to do. So with my memoir, even though I was, in some ways trying to tell my own story and kind of be accountable to my own story rather than telling the stories that I'd inherited either from my husband or in the case of my second novel, my father, I was still telling the story of my husband in a certain way. So really the book that I'm working on now, even though I think I'm kind of working from a similar kind of sociological perspective, it's the
Hmm.
first time where I'm inventing much more and I feel
Ooh,
less beholden to sort of telling the story of a true time and place, even if it's fictionalized. Does that make sense?
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's so interesting. Yeah, I'm curious of like the reflections I mean, you kind of incorporated the reflections you've had since writing those other books, and you're taking on this new way of writing, which is kind of awesome and beautiful and probably stressful, which I already know it's a little stressful.
Yeah.
Like,
It's always
that's,
stressful, right?
yeah, yeah, it's always stressful. Um, was it ever a dream or thought of yours that your writing would become a movie, let alone a movie where a crush you had when you were a teenager would be starring in that film? Speaking of Ethan Hawke, of course.
Yes, my boyfriend. Yes, it was actually. I mean, to be honest, yes, of course, it was my dream. I guess not every writer has this dream, but definitely it was on my mind. I had conceived of the book as a screenplay for a short time and worked on it as a screenplay in one of its iterations just to sort of, think about it a little bit more cinematically. Of course, I didn't ever expect it to become a movie, but it was something I definitely daydreamed about. And on days where I was procrastinating, I would, cast characters. And then it actually became a book after many attempts and many deals falling through. I sort of decided that this was something that was never going to happen. So when it actually did, it was pretty thrilling.
Was that your agent then kind of like, hey, let's see if we can make this a book or make this a movie?
Yeah, so the agency I work with doesn't represent film, but they work with other agents who represent film rights. So the book, as is pretty common, I guess, was making its rounds in galley form to people in the movie business. And so shortly after the book came out, I had some conversations with a couple of different um, uh, film companies. And, it's just really hard to get a movie made from a book. So
Yeah.
both of those things, they couldn't quite get critical mass to happen. So I'm glad that it took a while, but I ended up working with a really wonderful team in Sherry Springer Berman and Robert Pulcini, who I think really understood the book and did a beautiful job with it.
That's awesome. And I saw you let go of creative control of the book too. Like, what was that decision like? Like, and why did you make that decision?
Yeah, I think because the deal had fallen through a couple of times and I was so close to seeing it happen that I really just wanted to sign away anything and everything. I would have, signed anything at that point that they handed to me, which,
Mm,
maybe was a little bit desperate in retrospect. And if I ever have the opportunity again, I don't think lightning will ever strike twice, but I would probably do it differently because I think it would be interesting to be more involved. I really like film and I like thinking about adaptation. In fact, I already was teaching a class on adaptation at Ithaca College
ooh,
before this even came to be. So it was something that I was really interested in and really wanted to see happen. I think that I was in a good space because of doing all of that reflecting and teaching and really understanding that the movie was going to be a different piece of art from the book and it didn't have to be an equivalent. And I learned a lot through watching them adapt the book. So even though it was at times a little bit anxiety producing to not know what was happening with the process, I
mhm.
didn't see the screenplay until quite late in the process. So even though there were times where I felt, in the dark, I still, enjoyed being somebody who was just mostly just receiving this gift, this other piece of art, rather than, being responsible for carrying it, something that I wouldn't have been able to do by myself, obviously.
Is adaptation like what's the relationship, would you say, between adaptation and translation? Because I kept thinking about translation, but it's different for this process. Would you say?
Yeah, that is an interesting comparison. I mean, I guess with translation, you're translating from one language to another with the understanding that probably most people aren't going to speak both languages. But with adaptation, most viewers or readers are going to be fluent in both film and literature. And so I think they're also invested in and interested in the questions of adaptation if they're experiencing both forms. They want to see how is this going to be presented given this new medium and its restrictions and possibilities. So, just as an example, I'm a really slow writer and it takes me a long time to get something done. And so it was pretty magical for me to see that it took 3 chapters for me to accomplish something that Sherry and Bob were able to execute in, a 20-second restaurant conversation. I thought, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, I could have just gotten all the characters around the table and they could have taken care of this problem very efficiently. So, I love a novel that is like full of juicy detail and world building, but I also really appreciated the efficiency of the screenplay. Like I could not have written it, but in some ways I learned a lot as a writer from it.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that. Seeing the movie, what were some ways it may have, you think, like, had you think about your writing, if at all? Like, how were there reflections like, oh, I can think about this in this way or this in that way?
Yeah. I had too many characters. Well,
Mm.
one of the interesting things was, I was present on set for several days of shooting. It shot over 28 days in 2014 during the polar vortex and in and around New York City. And I got to be on set mostly just as a fly on the wall, which was a really interesting and strange and surreal experience. And I had seen several scenes shot with these 2 young actors who were playing characters in the book who seemed to me to be extremely essential to the story.
Hmm.
2 of Jude's friends.
Hmm.
And when I saw the final cut of the movie, I didn't even notice that they had not made the final cut. They weren't even in any of the scenes.
Mm.
And I thought, oh, I didn't even need them. I mean, I think I could justify their existence in the book, but I think I tend to kind of populate the world more than I need to. And so seeing a screenplay, really elegant 130-minute screenplay, really kind of boiling down and looking at what the essential story is, who are the essential
Mm.
people, then the structure of the story, I think, was really revealed itself in ways that were exciting to me to see.
That's cool. Did you get to have conversations with any of the actors about the characters they were playing?
I did, yeah. I remember meeting Asa Butterfield in a minivan as we were stuffing toe warmers into our shoes. And we mostly just had conversations about, what he was doing as a teenager. He and Haley Steinfeld were both minors then, and so they were getting tutored on the side as they were also
Oh,
coming in
wow.
and out of these warming vans. And so talking with both of them, and sometimes their parents were on set, and seeing these like teenagers who were going through the same things that some of, my characters were, but also,
Hmm.
working and doing school. That was very interesting and impressive. But probably the person I talked to most about the character himself was Ethan, who
Mm.
was, as you mentioned, uh, heartthrob of mine as a teenager, and he also was a novelist. So I think
I
it
saw
was
that too.
so cool to be able to, yeah, get him to sign my copy of The Hottest State, which I think came out in 1995. I had it in hardcover, and he got to sign that for me. And I think he took the sort of literariness of the role seriously. My agent is like a friend of his and went into his home and saw 10,000 Saints on his desk, sort of marked up with, different comments that he was making. And so it really meant a lot to me that, he was, for one, reading the book and understanding who the character was on the page.
Hmm.
It doesn't surprise me given that he's also a writer, but one of the things that did surprise me and was a little humbling was, most people who are on the set not only had they not read the book, but they probably didn't know it was a book. It really,
Right.
it really had moved, far beyond its roots. So that took a moment to sort of adjust to, but the pacing of the industry is such that some of these characters were cast a few weeks before shooting started, and so they didn't have time to read the book.
No.
They were reading it here or there, and there were 100 people on set who were, doing hair and doing the settings, and um, they, were at work. And I was in some ways inessential, just sort of in the background. Like I easily could not have been there, and the whole thing would have gone on just fine. But it was strange to realize that also they were all there because of a story I had written, and had I not been there, they also wouldn't be there. So it was a very strange relationship to seeing my own story told back to me.
Hmm. That's like kind of meta, a little surreal, right?
Yeah, it was trippy. It was trippy.
Um, I kind of wanted to just because like I like thinking about artists like core values and like reflections. And I watched this interview Jane Roper, the Zeitgeist, and it's about your remind me of the name again.
Everything I have is yours.
Yeah, everything I have is yours, which made me think of it actually it made me think of like, oh, like that first book you wrote was kind of part of Aaron too, in a way, like his life, like and him moving forward, like into the future with you. That kind of like made me think of that. And
Yeah.
I'm still thinking about because it's come up with like some musicians like vulnerability and control as an artist.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm going to read this. It says, I was very interested in this idea, like how do we write about somebody else's pain without appropriating it or without causing harm? And I knew that writing about this illness, speaking of Aaron, in some ways I was pretending that the very thing that I was trying not to do or trying to learn not to do, which was to let go of the control of the story. And writing the book was the thing that helped me to contain and understand as I was learning through the writing of the book that I had to let go of any hope of really controlling or understanding. I wonder what your relationship is now today with like controlling and understanding or that desire to control like the things you create or the desire to control like helping or being able to take care of a loved one at the heightened moments where it's most needed and you know and also like when do you need to know you need to allow yourself to be vulnerable also.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question that I think I'm still trying to figure out for myself, and maybe I always will with, each project. That definitely was true for me with the memoir. I was writing a memoir for the first time and trying to figure out that genre and recognizing with some discomfort that I was in the story I was telling, trying to relinquish control over my husband's illness, and yet the instrument I was using to tell that story was inherently a controlling one. I had control, I had power. And, that's something that came up in my other books in certain ways too, being able to sort of, appropriate one's pain or one's experience through writing about it. There's a sort of possessiveness, there's a sort of domination in that act. And I think that's true with a lot of writing. I think I have probably tried with the current project I'm working on, again, to sort of choose material that feels less like it's susceptible to that kind of domination. But I don't know that we ever really can totally discard that responsibility that comes with writing. In my life, I've gotten better at trying not to control others around me. So I'm a card carrying member of Al-Anon, and one of the things that we talk about in that 12-step program is, detaching with love and letting other people walk their own paths. They have their own higher power.
What's
But
Al-Anon?
Al-Anon is the family program for family members of addicts and alcoholics.
Mm,
And so I write about it in my memoir quite a bit, this learning that I did through that program because I was in a place of utter codependence in my relationship. And
mm.
so while I have become, I think, less codependent, definitely
Sure.
a total recovered codependent in my life, there are certain roles, including being a parent and being a writer,
Mhm,
where you are always going to have more control over some people in
mhm.
that relationship. So um, I guess, my best answer is trying to always sort of keep my eye on it and trying as much as possible to be aware of my own positionality. But that doesn't, erase that responsibility.
Yeah, well, I mean, with your new novel, you said you're, just making a bunch of stuff up, right? Like
That
it's kind of
is
like,
what a novel is, right? Am I allowed to do that?
yeah, you're totally allowed. I'm telling you right now, you're very allowed to do
Thank
that.
you, Jonah. I mean, I do take a lot of inspiration from writers like you who maybe seem a little bit more comfortable in the sort of speculative space. I mean, for me as a reader, it's a very exciting space. And so I am having a lot of fun with material that's a little bit, a little futuristic, a little science fiction, but it's difficult for me to remind myself sometimes that I don't have to be dependent on our current structures and that some of the freedom that I'm looking for is something that I need to give myself permission to explore.
That's powerful that you know that. And for the record, I find it almost as a necessity that I write weird stuff. Like, I'm like, can this just be a little weirder? It's kind of similar to like when people are talking, my brain it hears jokes, it hears satire like right away, and I have to like decide like make very specific choices not to say anything or just laugh to myself. Like,
You could always say it to me. That's a mega talent, though. And when I read something, I'm always asking for it to be weirder. I mean, I
mm,
literally just said this to a friend yesterday when I was giving her feedback on a piece she wrote. Like, I just responded so much to the weirdness of it. And my advice is almost always like, just lean into the weird, keep making it weird, I said. But
yeah.
sometimes I'm afraid to do that myself. I don't know where that comes from, um, because I love to see a weird risk in fiction, and I feel like our culture has more and more of an appetite for it.
I'm afraid of certainty, and it sounds like you want certainty.
Wait, what do you mean you're afraid of what kind of certainty?
Like a lot of times I'm just like I want to do things like the right way. So like in my writing sometimes just like doing it however is more comfortable because I don't have to worry about if I'm like doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think I hear you. Yeah. Like I'm purposely like uh, reversing this rule or expectation or something. Yeah. I do find that I'm more aware than I would like of, a reader's expectations. And maybe this is
Yeah.
more true with my, later books, having written one. Like with the first novel, I think I, in some ways, felt a lot of freedom because, if my mom read it, I would have been happy. But, with the privilege of having, a publisher and an audience, then there's that sort of inherent pressure of, well, it's got to be the same or it's got to be better or whatever.
Yeah. Well, thanks for doing the interview. I'm glad you took the time. Thanks for taking the time out of your day.
Thank you for reading my book
Yeah, it was fun.
and watching the movie, and then also like doing research on my interviews, which is thanks for getting my YouTube rating up by one more person, or maybe 11 people, maybe some of those.
You gotta do it.